I would appreciate it if you could show your support by liking and subscribing to the video before you start watching. You're standing in a cave in what is now southern France. 18,000 years ago, the wind outside howls with a fury that could strip flesh from bone. Snow has been falling for 3 months straight. Your stomach hasn't held real food in 6 days. The mammoth bones scattered around the cave floor have been cracked and re-cracked. Every drop of marrow long since consumed. Your children's ribs are showing through their skin. And in your hand, you hold something that would make a modern person vomit. A writhing mass of beetle larvae, still warm from the rotting log you just split open. This is your dinner. This is survival. We think we know hunger. We think we understand desperation. We imagine our Ice Age ancestors as noble hunters bringing down mighty beasts in epic battles against nature. But the truth is far more disturbing, far more human, and infinitely more desperate than any Hollywood portrayal could capture. For over 100,000 years, during the harshest climate periods our species has ever endured, humans didn't just hunt and gather. They scraped, scavenged, and consumed things that would horrify us today. Archaeological evidence from sites across Europe, Asia, and the Americas reveals a stark reality. When the ice sheets advanced and the world became a frozen wasteland, our ancestors turned to food sources so extreme, so revolting, and so dangerous that they challenge every assumption we have about prehistoric life. The worm glaciation, the last great ice age, wasn't just cold. It was a 100,000-year death sentence for most life on Earth. Temperatures dropped by an average of 12 degrees Celsius. Massive ice sheets, some over a mile thick, crushed entire continents. Plant life withered and died. The great herds of mammoth, bison, and reindeer that supposedly fed our ancestors? They were starving too, their numbers decimated by the relentless cold. But here's what will shock you. Humans didn't just survive this apocalyptic nightmare. They thrived. And they did it by eating things that would make a modern survivalist quit. Rotting fish eyes, fermented seal blubber crawling with maggots, human placenta, tree bark ground with crushed insects. And in the darkest moments, when all else failed, they crossed the final taboo. The evidence is written in their bones, carved into cave walls, and buried in archaeological sites from Siberia to Spain. But this wasn't just about food. It was about the birth of human innovation, the dark psychology of survival, and the terrible choices that forge our species into the ultimate survivors. What you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about human resilience, and reveal why some of these extreme survival strategies are still practiced in remote corners of the world today. The story begins when the world itself became humanity's greatest enemy, when survival meant abandoning every moral boundary our species had ever established, and when the line between civilization and savagery disappeared beneath layers of ice and desperation. You'll witness the moment when entire communities made the decision to cross humanity's deepest taboos. You'll discover survival technology so sophisticated it required generations of perfect, yet so revolting they challenge our basic understanding of human psychology. And you'll learn how the darkest chapter in human prehistory created psychological adaptations that still shape our behavior today. The archaeological sites tell stories that took decades to piece together and longer to accept. At Goff's Cave in England, scientists found evidence of systematic human processing that went beyond desperate cannibalism. It was organized, methodical, and passed down through generations. In the frozen caves of Siberia, they discovered fermentation pits where rotting fish was transformed into life-saving nutrition through controlled decomposition that would horrify modern food scientists. Across the mammoth steppes of Ice Age Europe, they uncovered bone processing sites where humans spent decades cracking open ancient skeletons to extract every possible calorie. But the most disturbing discovery of all was the realization that these weren't isolated incidents of desperate people pushed beyond their limits. These were established cultural practices, refined over millennia, that became so deeply embedded in human psychology that some communities couldn't abandon them even when the ice retreated and normal food became abundant again. The transition from the ice age to our modern climate wasn't just an environmental shift. It was a psychological crisis that nearly destroyed human civilization. Communities that had spent 70,000 years learning to see other humans as potential food sources suddenly had to rebuild the social bonds that extreme survival had systematically destroyed. This is the story of how humanity's greatest triumph, surviving the worst climate crisis in our species' history, became our deepest trauma, one that echoes through every aspect of modern human behavior, from our hoarding instincts to our capacity for systematic cruelty, from our disgust responses to our social hierarchies. We are still living with the psychological adaptations that enabled our ancestors to survive by consuming the unthinkable. The ice has retreated, but the Ice Age mind endures. The year was approximately 70,000 BC, and the world was ending, not in fire, but in ice, an unstoppable, grinding advance of frozen death that will remake every continent on Earth. The worm glaciation began with a subtle shift in global weather patterns. Summer temperatures in northern Europe dropped just 2 degrees. But in the brutal mathematics of climate, those 2 degrees triggered a cascade that would bury half the world under ice. Massive glaciers, some stretching over 2,000 miles across, began their slow march southward. In North America, the Laurentide ice sheet grew so massive it reached nearly to present-day St. Louis. In Europe, ice buried everything north of the Thames. But the true horror wasn't the ice itself. It was what happened to everything that lived in its path. Dr. Clive Finlayson, archaeological evidence from Gibraltar, shows us exactly what our ancestors faced. The populations that survived weren't the strongest or the fastest, he documented in his excavations of Gorham's Cave. They were the ones willing to eat absolutely anything. The cave floors tell the story. Layers of ash mixed with the bones of birds, fish, shellfish, and stranger things. Crushed beetle carapaces. Chewed tree bark. The processed remains of food so desperate that modern archaeologists initially couldn't identify them. Picture this. You're part of a family group of 20 humans, somewhere in what is now southern Spain. It's been winter for 8 months. The berries and roots your people depended on have long since disappeared under 6 feet of snow. The deer have migrated south, beyond your range. The rivers have frozen solid. Your stored food ran out weeks ago, and then your eldest child stops walking, simply sits down in the snow and refuses to get up. You can see their bones through their skin. Their eyes have that glassy, distant look of someone whose body is consuming its own muscle tissue to survive. This is when our ancestors made their first desperate leap into the unthinkable. Archaeological evidence from the site of Abergarominey in Spain shows clear patterns of what researchers delicately call subsistence intensification. The technical term hides a brutal reality. When the large game disappeared, our ancestors turned to progressively smaller, more difficult, and more revolting food sources. First, birds and small mammals. Then, insects, grubs, and larvae. Then, anything that moved. Finally, things that had stopped moving days ago. The bone assemblages tell the story with mathematical precision. In the early layers of Ice Age sites, archaeologists find the bones of mammoth, bison, and horse. The classic Ice Age megafauna. We imagine our ancestors hunting. But in the deeper, more desperate layers, they find something else entirely. The crushed shells of every conceivable mollusk. Bird bones cracked open for marrow. The processed remains of insects. carefully collected and prepared. And in the very deepest layers, the ones from the harshest climate periods, they find evidence that challenges every romanticized notion we have about prehistoric life. What we're seeing, explains Dr. Antonio Rosas from the Spanish National Research Council, is a pattern of survival that required a complete psychological break from normal human food preferences. These weren't hunting cultures anymore. They were scavenging cultures, willing to process and consume organic matter that we would consider inedible or toxic. The transformation wasn't gradual. Climate data from ice cores shows that temperature drops during the worst periods happen within decades, sometimes within years. Entire ecosystems collapsed faster than human communities could adapt their traditional survival strategies. The choice was simple: evolve or die. But evolution, in this case, meant abandoning every cultural norm, every disgust response, every social taboo that had previously defined human behavior. Communities that had spent millennia developing complex hunting rituals and food preparation traditions suddenly had to teach their children that survival meant eating things that would make their grandparents vomit. The psychological impact was devastating and permanent. Archaeological evidence from sites across Europe shows clear breaks in cultural continuity during the harshest climate periods. Tool-making traditions that had persisted for thousands of years suddenly disappeared. Artistic practices vanished. Even burial rituals, one of the most conservative aspects of human culture, changed dramatically as communities prioritized immediate survival over respect for the dead. At the site of Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, archaeologists found evidence of this cultural breakdown in stark detail. The early layers show sophisticated tool production, elaborate artistic works, and careful burial practices. But the deeper layers, from the peak glacial periods, show something entirely different. Crude, hastily made tools, no artistic production, and burial practices that suggest the dead were processed for resources before being interred. The most chilling evidence comes from the site of Les Izes in France, where archaeologists found what can only be described as a survival manual carved into cave walls. Detailed drawings showing which insects were safe to eat, which plant roots could be processed to remove toxins, and which bones contained the most marrow. But the most disturbing images show systematic processing of human remains, suggesting that communities had developed detailed protocols for crossing the final taboo. The scale of environmental change during this period cannot be overstated. Pollen analysis shows that entire forest ecosystems disappeared within generations. Rivers that flowed for millions of years froze solid for decades at a time. Animal species that had sustained human communities for millennia went extinct or migrated thousands of miles beyond human reach. But our ancestors didn't just adapt to this catastrophe. They systematized their response to it. The archaeological record shows clear evidence of knowledge transfer between communities, suggesting that survival techniques were being shared across vast distances through trade networks and cultural exchange. This wasn't random desperation. This was the birth of a new kind of human culture, one based entirely on the systematic exploitation of resources that no previous generation had considered food. But this was only the beginning of their descent into survival's darkest territories. The transformation began with a sound that every Ice Age survivor learned to recognize: the wet crunch of rotting wood splitting open to reveal the pale, writhing treasure inside. It was 45,000 years ago in what is now the Czech Republic. A family group had been following the Danube River Valley, searching for the massive herds of woolly rhinoceros that usually wintered in the area. But the herds weren't there. The harsh reality was setting in. The large game animals that supposedly sustained Ice Age humans were becoming increasingly rare, driven to extinction by the same climate that was slowly killing everything else. That's when someone, probably a child, driven by the desperation of true starvation, pulled apart a fallen tree trunk and made a discovery that would change human survival strategy forever. The log was crawling with life. Fat, white beetle larvae, each one the size of a human thumb, packed with protein and fat. But here's what makes this discovery so remarkable. These weren't just emergency food. Archaeological analysis on the site of Dolny Vestinus shows that Ice Age humans developed sophisticated techniques for harvesting, processing, and even storing insect protein. They learned to read the forest like a menu of hidden calories. Certain types of beetle larvae, particularly those of the rhinoceros beetle and the European stag beetle, could be harvested in massive quantities during specific seasons. A single rotting oak tree could yield pounds of high-protein larvae. And unlike the large game animals that were disappearing, insects were reliable, renewable, and available even in the harshest weather. But consuming them required a complete psychological revolution. Dr. Julie Dunn from the University of Bristol has analyzed residue from Ice Age cooking vessels and found clear evidence of insect processing. They weren't just eating these things raw, she explains. They were developing complex preparation methods, roasting, grinding into paste, even fermenting them for preservation. The evidence is stomach-turning and brilliant in equal measure. At the site of Paviland Cave in Wales, archaeologists found specialized tools, thin bone needles and small scrapers, specifically designed for extracting insects from bark and wood. More disturbing, they found evidence that our ancestors were cultivating insect colonies, essentially farming maggots in controlled environments. Picture the process. Ice Age humans would identify dying animals, preferably large ones like mammoth or bison, and carefully manage the decomposition process to maximize maggot production. They would cover the carcass with specific materials to control temperature and moisture, then harvest the resulting larvae in systematic waves. One mammoth carcass could produce hundreds of pounds of maggot protein over several months. The psychological impact of this dietary shift can't be overstated. These weren't primitive people mindlessly consuming anything available. These were sophisticated hunter-gatherers who had developed complex cultural taboos around food. They had to overcome deep-seated revulsion, the same revulsion modern humans feel when confronting insect protein, in order to survive. And the insects were just the beginning. Archaeological evidence from sites across Europe shows that Ice Age survivors developed increasingly sophisticated knowledge of unconventional protein sources. They learned to identify and process dozens of species of grubs, beetles, ants, and termites. They discovered which ones were toxic and which were safe. They developed seasonal harvesting calendars based on insect life cycles. But perhaps most disturbing of all, they began teaching this knowledge to their children as normal, necessary skills. Cave paintings from the site of Cueva de los Manos in Argentina show small figures engage in what appears to be insect gathering. Children learning to identify the subtle signs that indicated a log or rock was harboring edible larvae. This wasn't desperate scavenging anymore. This was a complete cultural adaptation to a world where traditional food sources had vanished. The most chilling discovery came from a site near modern-day Prague, where archaeologists found what can only be described as an insect processing facility. Stone grinding surfaces, specialized scrapers, and storage pits filled with the processed remains of thousands of insects. The scale suggests not just survival, but systematic exploitation of an entirely new food web. Chemical analysis of the processing sites reveals techniques that would impress modern entomologists. Ice Age humans had learned to separate different types of insect protein, process them using specific techniques optimized for each species, and even combine different insects to create nutritionally balanced food sources. They discovered that certain beetle larvae were rich in fats essential for brain development. Others provided specific vitamins that prevented disease during the long winter months. They learned to process ant colonies to extract formic acid, which acted as a natural preservative. They even developed techniques for harvesting and processing insect eggs, creating concentrated protein sources that could sustain a person for days. The sophistication of their insect knowledge rivals anything developed by modern survival experts. They understood seasonal patterns, migration routes, and breeding cycles of dozens of insect species. They could predict when and where to find specific types of larvae based on weather patterns, tree health, and other environmental factors. But the most remarkable aspect of their insect harvesting wasn't the techniques themselves. It was a cultural framework they developed to make these practices psychologically acceptable. Archaeological evidence suggests that Ice Age communities develop elaborate rituals and beliefs around insect consumption, transforming what should have been revolting into something sacred. At sites across Europe, archaeologists have found evidence of insect-related artistic works. Cave paintings showing humans in ritual communion with insects, carved figures of beetle larvae that appear to have religious significance, even burial goods that include processed insect remains. They had successfully rewired not just their survival strategies, but their entire cultural understanding of what constituted acceptable food. Children who grew up during this period would have considered insect protein as normal and natural as modern children consider bread or milk. But as the ice sheets continued to advance, even insects became scarce. The sound echoed to the cave like gunshots, the sharp crack of bones shattering under stone hammers. But this wasn't tool making or weapon crafting. This was something far more desperate and far more telling about the lengths humans would go to survive. It was 32,000 years ago, deep in the heart of what is now Siberia. The Yana rhinoceros horn site preserves one of the most complete pictures of Ice Age survival we've ever discovered. And what archaeologists found there challenges every assumption about prehistoric nutrition. The bone pile was staggering. Hundreds of mammoth bones, systematically cracked, processed, and discarded. But these weren't the bones of freshly killed animals. Carbon dating revealed something disturbing. Many of these bones were already decades old when humans began processing them. Our ancestors weren't hunting fresh mammoth. They were scavenging ancient carcasses, cracking open bones that had been frozen in the permafrost for generations. Dr. Vladimir Patulko, who led the excavation, described the scene. What we found wasn't evidence of successful hunting. It was evidence of systematic bone processing on an industrial scale. These people had developed techniques for extracting every calorie from skeletal remains that other scavengers had long since abandoned. The process was as ingenious as it was revolting. Ice Age survivors learned to identify bones that still contained marrow, even after years of exposure. They developed specialized tools, heavy stone hammers and wedges, designed specifically for cracking open the largest bones. They learned to heat bones over fires to make the marrow easier to extract. They even developed methods for processing marrow from bones so old that the exterior had been bleached white by decades of weather. But here's what makes this discovery truly disturbing. The evidence suggests they were traveling vast distances specifically to locate and process ancient boneyards. Archaeological evidence from sites across northern Eurasia shows networks of bone processing camps, connected by travel routes that span hundreds of miles. These weren't random scavenging expeditions. These were systematic resource exploitation trips, with human groups coordinating to strip every possible calorie from mammoth graveyards that have been accumulating for millennia. The psychological implications are staggering. Modern humans are repulsed by the idea of consuming marrow from fresh bones, let alone bones that have been weathering in the elements for decades. But Ice Age survivors overcame this revulsion so completely that they built their entire survival strategy around it. And the marrow extraction was just the beginning of their bone utilization techniques. At the site of Boronkaia 3 in Crimea, archaeologists found evidence of something even more disturbing: systematic processing of human bones for marrow extraction. The cut marks are unmistakable. The processing techniques identical to those used on animal bones. The implications unavoidable. We're not talking about cannibalism in the traditional sense, explains Dr. Sandrine Pratt from a French National Center for Scientific Research. We're talking about resource maximization under extreme duress. When you're facing starvation, the distinction between human and animal protein becomes academic. The bone assemblages tell a story of escalating desperation. In the early phases of Ice Age occupation, humans targeted the largest, most marrow-rich bones: femurs, humeri, the massive bones of mammoth and woolly rhinoceros. But as these resources became depleted, they moved to progressively smaller bones: ribs, vertebrae, even the tiny bones of fingers and toes. The most sophisticated bone processing site ever discovered was found in Belgium at the Cave of Spy. Here, Ice Age survivors had established what can only be described as a bone processing factory. Multiple fire hearths arranged in a systematic pattern. Specialized tools for every stage of bone breaking and marrow extraction. Even evidence of bone grease rendering, a process where crushed bones were boiled to extract the last traces of fat from the bone matrix itself. The scale of processing at Spy is mind-boggling. Archaeologists estimate that the site processed bones from over 500 individual animals: mammoth, bison, horse, reindeer, and others. But the really disturbing discovery was the evidence of systematic processing of bones that were already ancient when the site was occupied. Carbon dating revealed that some of the bones being processed were over 1,000 years old when humans began working on them. This means Ice Age survivors were not just scavenging recently dead animals. They were systematically mining prehistoric boneyards, extracting marrow from skeletal remains that had been accumulating for centuries. The techniques they developed for identifying marrow-bearing bones were remarkably sophisticated. They learned to recognize subtle color changes that indicated preserved marrow. They developed acoustic techniques, tapping bones with stones to listen for the hollow sound that indicated empty marrow cavities versus the dense sound of preserved marrow. They even learned to assess the weight distribution of bones to estimate marrow content before investing the energy required for processing. But perhaps most disturbing was their development of predictive models for locating ancient bone deposits. Archaeological evidence suggests that Ice Age communities maintained detailed knowledge of boneyard locations across vast territories, passed down through generations like valuable intelligence. They knew where mammoth herds had died decades or centuries earlier, and they planned systematic expeditions to exploit these resources when other food sources failed. The social implications of this bone mining economy were profound. Communities developed specialized roles: bone scouts who could identify promising deposits, processing specialists who had mastered the techniques for maximum marrow extraction, and transport teams who could carry processed bone products across vast distances. They even developed quality control systems. Archaeological evidence shows that certain bone processing attempts were abandoned midway through when the processors determined that the energy required for extraction exceeded the nutritional value of the remaining marrow. But even this systematic exploitation of every available bone wasn't enough to ensure survival during the worst climate periods. The stench would have been overwhelming. The putrid smell of fish that had been rotting in underground pits for months, deliberately fermented until the flesh turned to liquid and the eyes became translucent globes of concentrated nutrition. It was 28,000 years ago, along the shores of what is now Lake Baikal in Siberia. The massive freshwater lake had become one of the last refuges for Ice Age survivors, a place where life persisted even as the rest of the world turned to frozen wasteland. But surviving here required techniques so revolting, so psychologically challenging, that they reveal the true depths of human adaptability. Archaeological evidence from the site of Mount Tiburet shows clear proof of systematic fish fermentation on a massive scale. Deep storage pits, lined with mammoth hide and sealed with stones, designed specifically for controlled decomposition of fish protein. But these weren't simple food storage facilities. They were biochemical processing plants, using bacterial fermentation to transform inedible fish parts into concentrated nutrition. The process was as sophisticated as it was nauseating. Ice Age survivors learned to control fermentation by managing temperature, moisture, and bacterial cultures. They discovered that fish eyes, normally discarded as inedible, became concentrated sources of vitamins and fats when properly fermented. They learned that fish bones, when fermented long enough, became soft enough to consume entirely, providing crucial calcium and phosphorus. Dr. Anastasia Ablamanova, who has studied Siberian fermentation techniques, explains the process. What we're seeing is advanced biochemistry applied to survival nutrition. These people understood fermentation in ways that would impress modern food scientists. They were using controlled bacterial cultures to break down proteins and fats that would normally be indigestible or toxic. But the most disturbing aspect of this fermentation process wasn't the science. It was a psychological adaptation required to consume the results. Imagine the scene. It's the middle of winter. Temperatures are 40 degrees below zero, and your family hasn't eaten in 4 days. You climb down into one of these fermentation pits and lift out what was once a fish, now transformed into a writhing mass of decomposing protein, crawling with maggots and bacteria. The smell is so intense it makes you gag. The texture is like thick soup mixed with chunks of cartilage. And this is your feast. This is what you feed your children. The archaeological evidence from Mount Tiburet includes specialized tools designed specifically for fermented fish processing, long bone needles for extracting fish eyes, scrapers for removing the liquefied flesh, even strainers made from mammoth hair for separating the liquid nutrients from the solid remains. But perhaps most disturbing of all, they were feeding this fermented fish to infants as early as 6 months old. Isotope analysis of children's bones from Ice Age sites across Siberia shows clear evidence of fermented fish protein consumption from a very early age. This means that entire generations grew up considering rotting, maggot-infested fish as normal food. The psychological adaptation was complete. They had successfully rewired their disgust responses to accept nutrition sources that would kill modern humans from sheer revulsion. And the fermented fish was just one component of their aquatic survival strategy. At sites along the Ob River in western Siberia, archaeologists found evidence of systematic processing of fish organs that modern humans consider inedible or toxic. Fish livers, fermented until they became paste-like concentrated vitamins A and D. Fish swim bladders, processed into protein-rich jellies. Even fish scales, ground and fermented until they became digestible sources of calcium and collagen. The most sophisticated aquatic processing site was discovered near modern-day Irkutsk, where Ice Age survivors had established what can only be described as a fish processing complex. Multiple fermentation pits arranged in systematic patterns. Specialized tools for every stage of fish decomposition and nutrient extraction. Even evidence of quality control. Certain pits were abandoned and sealed when the fermentation process went wrong and produced toxic rather than nutritious results. The scale of fish processing at these sites is staggering. Chemical analysis of soil samples suggests that single sites process thousands of fish annually, transforming them into concentrated nutrition sources that could sustain human groups through the harshest winter months. But the really remarkable discovery was evidence of fermented fish trading networks spanning hundreds of miles. Chemical signatures in fermented fish remains show that communities were specializing in specific types of fish processing and trading their products across vast distances. Some groups became experts in fermented salmon preparation. Others specialized in whitefish or Arctic char processing. This wasn't just survival. It was the birth of specialized food technology based entirely on controlled decomposition and bacterial fermentation. The fermentation techniques developed during this period were remarkably sophisticated. Ice Age communities learned to create specific bacterial environments that would break down fish proteins into amino acids while preventing the growth of harmful pathogens. They developed temperature control methods using controlled fires and insulated storage systems. They even learned to use specific plant materials as fermentation accelerators, adding precise combinations of bark, leaves, and roots to optimize the decomposition process. The most disturbing aspect of their fermentation knowledge was the development of human taste preferences for advanced decomposition. Archaeological evidence suggests that Ice Age communities preferred fish that had been fermenting for months over fresh fish, even when fresh fish was available. The fermentation process wasn't just about preservation. It was about creating flavors and textures that had become psychologically associated with high-nutrition food. Children growing up in these communities would have developed completely different taste preferences than modern humans. Foods that we consider revolting would have been associated with survival, safety, and abundant nutrition. The psychological programming was so complete that some communities appear to have continued fermented fish consumption long after the Ice Age ended and fresh food became abundant. But as the ice sheets reached their maximum extent, even these sophisticated fermentation techniques weren't enough. The evidence was carved into the walls themselves. Desperate scratches in stone, made by fingernails worn down to bloody nubs, scraping lichen and moss from cave surfaces with a determination that spoke of absolute desperation. It was 22,000 years ago, at the height of the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets reached their furthest extent, and the world became a frozen hell that tested human survival to its absolute limits. The cave of El Castillo in northern Spain preserves one of the most disturbing records of human starvation ever discovered. And what archaeologists found there reveals the psychological breaking point where survival instincts override every human taboo. The cave floor told a story in layers of ash, bone fragments, and human desperation. The deepest levels, from the harshest climate periods, contained evidence of food sources so extreme that it took decades for archaeologists to properly identify them. Lichen, moss, tree bark, leather from clothing and tools. And then, in the deepest level, something that made the excavation team stop work and call in forensic specialists. Dr. Jose Maria Bermudez de Castro, who led the excavation, describes the discovery. We found evidence of systematic processing of organic materials that crossed every boundary of what we consider acceptable human behavior. These weren't isolated incidents. These were established survival protocols that had been developed and refined over generations of extreme starvation. The evidence was undeniable. Systematic cut marks on human bones, processing tools stained with human blood proteins, fire-altered human remains that showed clear signs of cooking. The inhabitants of El Castillo had crossed the final taboo. But this wasn't random cannibalism driven by madness or desperation. The evidence suggests something far more disturbing: systematic, organized processing of human remains as a regular part of survival strategy. The bone assemblages show careful selection and processing techniques. Specific bones were targeted for marrow extraction. Certain body parts were processed, while others were left untouched. There was even evidence of food preparation techniques. Bones that had been roasted, ground into paste, or processed into concentrated protein sources. The most chilling discovery was evidence that this wasn't limited to processing the already dead. Cut marks on several bones suggest that some individuals were processed while still alive, in a systematic approach to resource maximization that defies every modern understanding of human behavior. We're looking at survival strategies that required a complete psychological break from normal human social bonding, explains Dr. Tim White, a specialist in prehistoric violence. These people had to rewire their fundamental emotional responses to their own species. They had stopped seeing other humans as individuals and start seeing them as resources. But the cannibalistic practices at El Castillo weren't unique. Similar evidence has been found at Ice Age sites across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. The Cave of Krapina in Croatia, the site of Fontbregua in France, the Anasazi sites of the American Southwest, a pattern of systematic human processing that spans continents and cultures. The psychological implications are staggering. These weren't isolated communities descending into madness. These were widespread survival strategies developed independently by human groups facing identical environmental pressures. The techniques were sophisticated, systematic, and passed down through generations as normal, necessary knowledge. At the site of Mancos in Colorado, archaeologists found evidence of human processing techniques so advanced they required specialized tools and coordinated group effort. Specific cutting techniques designed to maximize protein extraction, systematic bone-breaking patterns, even evidence of food preservation, human flesh that had been dried and stored for future consumption. The most disturbing aspect of these discoveries isn't the cannibalism itself. It's the evidence that these communities continue to function as social groups even while systematically consuming their own members. They maintain tool-making traditions, artistic practices, even complex burial rituals for some individuals while simultaneously processing others for food. This suggests a level of psychological compartmentalization that challenges our basic understanding of human social behavior. These people had developed the ability to simultaneously maintain normal human emotional bonds with some community members, while viewing others as food resources. The selection criteria for who was processed and who wasn't reveals a brutal calculus of survival. Analysis of the human remains shows clear patterns. The elderly, the sick, and the very young were processed first. But as conditions worsened, the selection criteria expanded to include healthy adults, chosen through methods that remain unclear but were apparently accepted by the surviving community members. At the height of the crisis, some communities appear to have developed systematic rotation systems, where community members took turns being processed to ensure the group's survival. The evidence suggests these weren't desperate, last-minute decisions. They were planned, organized systems with established protocols and social acceptance. The archaeological evidence from sites like Fontbregua shows that human processing had become so systematized that communities developed specialized tools and techniques specifically for human butchering, different cutting patterns for different body parts, specific bone-breaking techniques optimized for human anatomy, even evidence of human meat preparation methods designed to improve palatability and digestibility. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the evidence that some communities had begun deliberately fattening certain individuals before processing them. Isotope analysis of human remains from several Ice Age sites shows that some individuals were fed diets specifically designed to increase their body weight in the weeks before they were killed and consumed. This represents a complete transformation of human social relationships under extreme survival pressure. Communities had developed the psychological frameworks necessary to treat some of their members as livestock, managing their nutrition and health specifically to maximize their value as food resources. The technology was elegant in its simplicity, a series of stone grinding platforms, each one designed for processing a different type of organic matter that no modern human would consider edible. But for Ice Age survivors, these weren't tools of desperation. They were sophisticated food processing equipment, representing thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about extracting nutrition from the most unlikely sources. It was 20,000 years ago, at the archaeological site of Ohelo II near the Sea of Galilee. The remarkably preserved remains of an Ice Age campsite revealed something extraordinary. Evidence of systematic processing and consumption of over 150 different plant species, including dozens that modern humans consider inedible or toxic. The grinding stones tell the story with mathematical precision. Each surface was designed for specific materials. Large, coarse grinders for tough plant fibers. Smooth, polished surfaces for delicate seed processing. Even specialized tools for grinding materials so hard they would destroy normal stone implements. Dr. Ehud Weiss, who analyzed the plant remains from Ohelo II, made a startling discovery. These people weren't just eating anything they could find. They had developed sophisticated processing techniques that could make virtually any organic material digestible. They understood plant chemistry in ways that would impress modern nutritionists. The evidence was overwhelming. Tree bark, processed with specific grinding techniques that broke down the cellulose and made it digestible. Grass seeds from species that are toxic when consumed raw, but become nutritious when ground and heated in specific ways. Even pine needles, processed into a paste that provided crucial vitamin C during the winter months when no other sources were available. But the most remarkable discovery was evidence of systematic toxin removal from poisonous plants. Many of the plant species found at Ohelo II are naturally toxic, containing compounds that would kill humans if consumed directly. But Ice Age survivors had developed techniques for neutralizing these toxins and accessing the underlying nutrition. The process was as sophisticated as it was dangerous. Certain poisonous roots were ground, leached in water for specific periods, and then processed again until the toxic compounds were removed. Poisonous berries were fermented until the toxins broke down into harmless byproducts. Even mushrooms that would kill modern humans were processed using techniques that neutralized their deadly compounds. Picture the learning process required to develop this knowledge. Countless generations of trial and error, with the mistakes literally deadly. Families watching loved ones die from toxic plant consumption, then adjusting their processing techniques and trying again. The accumulated knowledge represented thousands of years of experimentation, with human lives as the cost of each failed attempt. The grinding stones at Ohelo II show were patterns that reveal the incredible volume of plant processing taking place. Some stones were worn down by decades of constant use. Others show evidence of specialized processing techniques, specific grinding motions and pressures designed for particular plant materials. But perhaps most remarkable of all was evidence of plant cultivation techniques designed specifically to increase the concentration of normally scarce nutrients. Ice Age survivors weren't just gathering wild plants. They were manipulating plant growth to maximize nutritional value. Archaeological evidence shows systematic burning of specific areas to encourage the growth of plants with higher protein content. Selective harvesting techniques designed to increase the yield of nutritious seeds and roots. Even primitive irrigation systems designed to concentrate plants in areas where they could be more easily harvested and processed. The scale of plant processing at Ice Age sites is staggering. At some locations, archaeologists found processing areas that could handle tons of plant material annually, specialized storage pits for different types of processed plants, even evidence of quality control. Certain processed plant materials were discarded when the processing went wrong and produced inedible or toxic results. The most sophisticated plant processing site was discovered in the Jordan Valley, where Ice Age survivors had established what can only be described as a food processing factory. Multiple grinding stations arranged in systematic patterns. Specialized tools for every stage of plant collection, processing, and storage. Even evidence of seasonal specialization. Different areas were used for processing different types of plants depending on when they were available. But the really remarkable discovery was evidence of plant processing techniques that could extract nutrition from materials that weren't just inedible, they were actively harmful to human digestion. Certain tree barks that contained compounds that would destroy the human digestive system were processed using techniques that not only neutralized the harmful compounds, but actually concentrated the underlying nutrition. The chemical analysis of processed plant remains shows that Ice Age survivors had achieved something that borders on alchemy. They had developed methods for transforming toxic, indigestible plant materials into concentrated nutrition sources. Some of their processing techniques were so effective that they could extract more usable nutrition from certain plants than modern industrial processing methods. They had learned to identify plants by their chemical signatures, not just their appearance. They could recognize which plants contained specific vitamins or minerals based on subtle changes in leaf color, root texture, or seed development. They developed processing calendars that tracked when different plants would be at peak nutritional value and when their toxic compounds would be at their lowest concentrations. The most disturbing aspect of their plant processing knowledge was the evidence that they had learned to deliberately consume certain toxic plants for their psychoactive properties. Some plant remains show processing techniques specifically designed to concentrate hallucinogenic compounds while reducing toxicity to survivable levels. This suggests that Ice Age communities were using plant-based drugs to help them psychologically cope with the extreme survival strategies they have been forced to adopt. The psychological trauma of systematically processing other humans for food, combined with the constant stress of starvation, apparently drove some communities to seek chemical escape through controlled poisoning. But as the ice sheets began their slow retreat, these sophisticated survival technologies faced their ultimate test. The desperation had reached its apex. Archaeological layers from 18,000 years ago, the absolute peak of the last glacial maximum, reveal survival strategies so extreme, so psychologically devastating, that they represent the darkest chapter in human prehistory. It was at this moment, when the ice sheets had locked up so much water that ocean levels dropped by 400 feet and vast areas of the continental shelves became frozen wastelands, that human communities made choices that would haunt their descendants for millennia. The Cave of Goths in Somerset, England, preserves the most complete record of this final collapse into absolute desperation. What archaeologists found there wasn't just evidence of cannibalism. It was evidence of systematic human farming. The bone assemblages tell a story that took years to piece together and decades to accept. Human remains showing evidence of deliberate fattening before processing. Systematic breeding practices designed to maximize human protein production. Even evidence of selective breeding. Certain individuals were kept alive specifically for reproductive purposes, while others were processed for immediate consumption. Dr. Sylvia Bello, who led the analysis of the Goths cave remains, struggled to describe what the evidence revealed. We're looking at human communities that had completely redefined the concept of humanity itself. They had developed systematic methods for managing human populations as livestock. This wasn't desperate cannibalism anymore. This was agricultural production, using human beings as a crop. The evidence was undeniable but horrifying. Specialized tools designed specifically for human processing. Systematic butchering techniques that maximize protein extraction. Even evidence of food preparation. Human remains that showed signs of specific cooking methods designed to improve taste and digestibility. But perhaps most disturbing of all was evidence that these human farming operations were coordinated across multiple communities. Chemical analysis of human remains from sites hundreds of miles apart showed similar processing techniques and even evidence of trade in processed human protein. The scale of human processing during this period is difficult to comprehend. At some sites, archaeologists found the processed remains of hundreds of individuals, all showing similar butchering patterns and processing techniques. The numbers suggest that entire communities were being systematically harvested to sustain other groups. The psychological mechanisms that allowed these practices to develop represent one of the most disturbing chapters in human behavioral evolution. Evidence suggests that communities developed elaborate social structures that define certain individuals as non-human, and therefore acceptable for processing. These weren't random selections. They were systematic classifications based on criteria that remain unclear, but were apparently accepted by the surviving community members. At the site of Fontbrégeois in southeastern France, archaeologists found evidence of human processing techniques so sophisticated they required specialized knowledge and coordinated group effort. Specific cutting techniques designed to maximize protein extraction, systematic bone-breaking patterns, even evidence of food preservation. Human flesh that had been processed and stored using the same techniques developed for animal meat. The most chilling discovery was evidence of systematic processing of children and infants. The bone assemblages show that young humans were specifically targeted, not because they were easier to overpower, but because their meat was considered more nutritious and palatable. Some sites show evidence of systematic infant processing on an industrial scale. The selection criteria for human processing became increasingly sophisticated during this period. Evidence suggests that communities developed complex systems for evaluating individuals based on their nutritional value, their potential for reproduction, and their utility for other survival tasks. Those who failed to meet the criteria were systematically processed using methods that had been refined over generations of practice. But the most disturbing aspect of this human farming system wasn't the processing itself. It was the evidence that these communities maintained normal social relationships with some individuals while simultaneously managing others as food resources. Archaeological evidence shows continued artistic production, tool making, and even elaborate burial rituals for certain community members, while others were being systematically butchered and consumed. The psychological compartmentalization required for this dual system challenges our fundamental understanding of human social behavior. These people had developed the ability to maintain complex emotional bonds with some individuals, while viewing others as nothing more than walking food supplies. As the ice sheets reached their maximum extent, some communities appear to have developed breeding programs specifically designed to maximize human protein production. Evidence suggests systematic pairing of individuals based on criteria related to meat production rather than normal human social bonding. The resulting offspring were raised specifically for eventual processing, creating multi-generational cycles of human livestock management. The most sophisticated human processing operation ever discovered was found in the caves of Atapuerca in northern Spain, where Ice Age survivors had established what can only be described as a human processing facility. Multiple butchering areas arranged in systematic patterns. Specialized tools for every stage of human processing. Even evidence of quality control. Certain processed human materials were discarded when the processing techniques failed to produce the desired results. The evidence from Atapuerca suggests that human farming had become so systematized that communities were actively breeding humans for specific characteristics. Larger individuals for maximum meat yield, smaller individuals for specialized processing tasks. Even evidence of selective breeding for docility. Human remains that show signs of systematic psychological conditioning designed to make processing easier and more efficient. The social structures that enabled these practices represent a complete breakdown of every moral and ethical framework that we consider fundamental to human civilization. Communities had developed elaborate hierarchies that classified individuals based on their value as food resources rather than their value as human beings. But as the climate began its slow shift toward warmth, these extreme survival strategies faced an unexpected challenge. The world was ending again, but this time in reverse. The ice sheets that had dominated human existence for over 70,000 years began their inexorable retreat, and the survival strategies that had sustained our ancestors through the frozen hell of the Ice Age suddenly became not just unnecessary, but dangerous. It was 15,000 years ago when the first signs appeared. Temperatures began rising at a pace that, while gradual by human standards, represented catastrophic change for ecosystems that had adapted to perpetual cold. The massive ice sheets that had shaped every aspect of human survival began releasing torrents of meltwater. Sea levels rose by hundreds of feet. Entire continents were reshaped as a geography that Ice Age humans knew disappeared beneath rising oceans. But the real crisis was environmental. It was psychological and social. Human communities that had spent millennia developing survival strategies based on extreme scarcity suddenly faced abundance they had no cultural framework to handle. The archaeological record from this transition period reveals a crisis that nearly destroyed human civilization. Communities that couldn't abandon their extreme survival behaviors even when they were no longer necessary. At the site of Starcar in Yorkshire, England, archaeologists found evidence of human communities that continued practicing cannibalism and extreme food processing long after normal food sources had become abundant. The layers from the early post-glacial period show continued use of human processing tools and techniques even when the same sites show evidence of abundant deer, fish, and plant resources. Dr. Paul Mellars, who studied the transition period, identified what he called survival lock-in, communities that had become so psychologically adapted to extreme scarcity that they couldn't recognize or respond to abundance. These people had spent 70,000 years learning that any food source, no matter how revolting, might be the difference between survival and death, he explained. They couldn't simply turn off those psychological adaptations when the ice retreated. The evidence reveals communities where generations of extreme survival had created cultural practices that persisted long after they served any practical purpose. Sites dating to 12,000 years ago, well into the warming period, still show evidence of systematic insect processing, bone marrow extraction from ancient remains, and even continued human processing, despite abundant alternative food sources. The transition crisis was complicated by the fact that many of the survival technologies developed during the Ice Age had become deeply embedded in cultural and religious practices. What had begun as desperate survival strategies had evolved into complex rituals and social systems that defined community identity. At the Ertbowl sites in Denmark, archaeologists found evidence of communities that had developed elaborate ceremonies around the consumption of fermented fish and processed insects, even though the warming climate had made fresh fish and game abundant. The rituals had become more important than the nutrition, creating a cultural lock that prevented adaptation to new conditions. But perhaps most disturbing was the evidence of communities that had become so psychologically dependent on extreme survival strategies that they couldn't function without the constant threat of starvation. Some groups appear to have artificially created scarcity conditions, destroying abundant food sources or preventing normal hunting and gathering in order to maintain the psychological stress patterns that had defined their culture for millennia. The site of Lepenski Vir in Serbia shows clear evidence of this artificial scarcity creation. Archaeological layers from the post-glacial period show that the community deliberately avoided exploiting abundant fish runs and game herds, instead continuing to process increasingly scarce resources using extreme techniques developed during the Ice Age. They were choosing starvation in the midst of abundance. The social implications were catastrophic. Communities split between those who could adapt to the new abundance and those who remained locked in Ice Age survival patterns. Archaeological evidence suggests that this transition period saw more internal violence and community collapse than the entire previous 70,000 years of Ice Age survival. Some groups that had survived the worst climate conditions in human history simply disintegrated when faced with the psychological challenge of abandoning the survival strategies that had defined their identity. They had become so adapted to extremity that normalcy was literally unthinkable. The warming period also revealed the true cost of the psychological adaptations that had enabled Ice Age survival. Communities that had successfully rewired their disgust responses and social bonding patterns found themselves unable to form normal human relationships when extreme survival was no longer necessary. Generations of children raised on fermented fish, processed insects, and worse found themselves unable to accept normal food sources or form normal social bonds. At the cave of La Rira in northern Spain, archaeologists found evidence of what can only be described as cultural suicide, a community that had been so successful at Ice Age survival that they literally couldn't survive the return to normal conditions. The site shows evidence of systematic destruction of food stores, abandonment of successful hunting grounds, and eventual complete population collapse, all occurring during a period of unprecedented environmental abundance. The most tragic evidence comes from sites where archaeologists found remains of children from the transition period showing clear signs of malnutrition and starvation, surrounded by evidence of abundant natural food sources that the community had culturally prohibited themselves from exploiting. The psychological trauma of the transition period created lasting changes in human culture that persist to this day. Communities that successfully made the transition did so by developing new cultural frameworks that could accommodate both their Ice Age survival knowledge and the new reality of abundance. But the process was neither smooth nor complete. Archaeological evidence suggests that many of the cultural taboos, religious practices, and social hierarchies that characterized later human civilizations originated during this transition period, as communities struggled to create new meaning systems that could replace the survival-focused cultures that had sustained them through the Ice Age. The transition crisis finally ended around 10,000 years ago, when the last communities either successfully adapted to post-glacial conditions or simply disappeared. But the psychological legacy of 70,000 years of extreme survival continued to shape human behavior in ways that are still visible today. The last mammoth died 4,000 years ago on Wrangel Island, a remote speck of land in the Arctic Ocean. But the survival strategies that sustained humans through 100,000 years of ice and desperation didn't die with it. They transformed, evolved, and embedded themselves so deeply in human culture that we're still living with their echoes today. Walk into any modern survivalist community, and you'll find them, the descendants of Ice Age knowledge, fermentation techniques that trace directly back to the rotting fish pits of Siberia, insect protein harvesting that echoes the beetle larvae processing of prehistoric Europe, even the psychological frameworks that allow humans to consume revolting foods in crisis situations. These are all inheritance from our Ice Age ancestors. But the deeper legacy isn't in our survival techniques. It's in our psychology, our social structures, and our fundamental relationship with scarcity and abundance. The human brain that could learn to see maggot-infested carrion as a feast, that could systematically process other humans for protein, while maintaining social bonds with survivors, that brain didn't disappear when the ice retreated. It's still there, buried beneath layers of civilization, waiting for the right conditions to resurface. Modern psychology recognizes what archaeologists discovered in those Ice Age caves. Human adaptability has no limits, including moral and social limits that we consider fundamental to our nature. The same psychological mechanisms that allowed our ancestors to farm other humans for protein operate today in every genocide, every famine, every social collapse where normal human bonds disintegrate under extreme pressure. But perhaps the most disturbing echo of all is our modern relationship with abundance. We live in the most resource-rich period in human history, yet we maintain psychological and social systems based on scarcity. We hoard, we compete, we consume resources we don't need, driven by neural pathways carved during 100,000 years of genuine scarcity. The survival strategies that sustained our species through the worst climate crisis in human history became so embedded in our psychology that we can't turn them off, even when they're no longer necessary. We're still Ice Age survivors, psychologically adapted to a world of extreme scarcity, trying to function in a world of unprecedented abundance. This wasn't just about food. It wasn't just about survival. It was about the fundamental transformation of human consciousness under extreme pressure. And that transformation is still with us, shaping every aspect of modern human behavior in ways we're only beginning to understand.